32 years of marriage, and yet I never imagined I would hear words that would make my whole body tremble. I came home during my lunch break to check on my sick husband, but what I heard inside my own house hit me like a punch to the chest, and from that moment on, nothing in my life would ever be the same. Thank you so much for watching and giving me a little of your time. It means more than I can ever put into words. Before I go on, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please tell me in the comments. I always enjoy hearing from you, because it makes me feel like I am not sitting here alone with my story. Now let me take you back to that day when I thought I was just doing something kind, when I thought I was checking on the man I had cared for all these years. When I walked into the house quietly with my heart full of worry and love, never expecting that in just a few seconds, everything I believed about him and about us would be torn apart. I have to tell you a little about myself, so you can understand how deep this cut really was. I am a woman who gave her whole life to her family. I grew up with little, and when I met the man I thought would be my forever, I poured every ounce of myself into building something steady and loving. I was not perfect, but I was loyal. Every day for 32 years, I woke up early to cook, to clean, to work, and to make sure he felt cared for in every possible way. I even had a habit of slipping a small note into his lunch bag, a simple line like, "Thinking of you," or "I'm proud of you," because I believed those little reminders kept a marriage alive. It was my way of saying without words that no matter what the world took from us, he still had me. When he got sick, or at least when he claimed to be sick, I was worried. I fussed over him like I always had. I made soups and teas. I tucked him in with extra blankets. I told myself that if I just showed patience and love, he would get better soon. Because that is what a wife does when she vows to be there in sickness and in health. She shows up without asking for anything in return. And that was what I thought I was doing. Looking back now, I see the small cracks that were already forming. The way he had started pulling away from me at night. The sudden excuses about being too tired to talk. The phone calls he would take outside or late in the evening when he thought I was asleep. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself after so many years together, I had no reason not to trust him. But deep down, some small part of me must have known something was wrong. Because that is the only reason I parked down the street that day instead of in the driveway, like I normally did. That is the only reason I crept into my own house like a stranger, my heart already holding a whisper of suspicion I could not name. And still, nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to hear. Because when you spend decades beside someone, sharing meals, sharing holidays, sharing a bed, you do not expect that the very person you trusted most would turn around and mock your love. You do not expect to find that the man you cared for while he pretended to be weak was in fact plotting behind your back. You do not expect betrayal to arrive in your living room, dressed in laughter. That morning had started like so many others. I woke up early and fixed a light breakfast before leaving for work. I tiptoed around the house so he could rest. I checked his temperature and he groaned like a man weighed down by sickness. I even laid out his medicine beside a glass of water before I kissed his forehead and told him I would check on him during lunch. He nodded weakly, coughing into his hand, convincing me that he was too fragile to even sit up straight. And with that image in my heart, I left for work, carrying worry on my shoulders, never suspecting that I was walking away from a stage he had carefully set. As I sat at my desk through the morning hours, I could not shake the unease building in my chest. I remembered the way he had waved me off quickly, as though my care was too much for him, and I tried to dismiss it as irritation from being sick. But my thoughts returned again and again to the little changes I had noticed. The way his eyes avoided mine when I asked questions, the way his phone seemed glued to his side, always face down as though its screen held a truth he dared not share. I told myself not to be paranoid. I told myself after decades of marriage I had no reason to spy or to doubt. But still something pressed on me, something heavy and whispering that I needed to look closer. So when the clock neared noon, I gathered my things and decided to go home. I did not call ahead, I did not send a message. I just wanted to surprise him with my presence. to see his face light up the way it used to when I walked in unexpectedly, and maybe, just maybe, to soothe my restless heart. I parked my car down the street instead of pulling into the driveway. I told myself it was so the sound would not disturb his rest. But now I realize it was instinct. Something deeper than reason guiding me to step softly, to move quietly, to enter my own house as though it no longer belonged fully to me. The house was still. Not a single cough or groan echoed from the rooms. The curtains hung heavy, and the air felt oddly light, as though it had not been touched by illness at all. I paused, holding my breath, listening, and then it came. The sound that froze me where I stood, not the weak voice of a sick man, but the steady, amused laughter of someone very much alive, strong, and full of secrets. I followed it with trembling steps, my heart pounding against my ribs, and the closer I got, the more I realized that what waited for me was not care or gratitude, but the raw truth of betrayal. And when I reached the living room doorway, when I pressed myself against the frame so I would not be seen, I saw him sitting there. Phone on speaker, voice full of charm I had not heard directed at me in years, and what spilled from his mouth in that moment began to unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. I stood there frozen, my hand pressed against the wall to keep myself steady, my ears straining to make sure I was hearing correctly, and then his words cut through the air like a blade. He said with a chuckle, "She's old, tired, the money is almost mine, a few more months, and I'll have the deed." And before I could even catch my breath, a woman's voice answered him with a laugh, light and careless. "You're cruel, but smart." Those words felt like stones thrown at my chest, knocking the air out of me. Because they weren't just talking about anyone, they were talking about me. About my life, about the home I worked for, about the years I spent building and sacrificing. And suddenly I was no longer a wife, listening to her husband. I was a stranger overhearing a conversation about how easily I could be discarded. My knees nearly gave way, and I had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. My mind raced back through every sacrifice I had made. The nights I stayed awake sewing to save money. The times I went without so that he could have what he wanted. The family gatherings I planned down to the smallest detail, just so he could sit proud and satisfied. And now I was hearing him strip all of that down to nothing more than a step in his greedy plan. I wanted to burst into the room, to shout, to demand answers, but instead I stood there trembling, tears blurring my vision. Because I knew the moment I made a sound, he would twist it. He would lie, he would turn it back on me, and I refused to give him that power. So I backed away slowly, each step heavy as though the house itself was pressing against me. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph now looking different, tainted, like they were mocking me for not seeing sooner. I slipped out as quietly as I had come in, my heart beating loud in my ears, and once I was outside I let the cool air wash over me, trying to steady my breath, trying to find strength in the middle of shock. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel, gripping it until my knuckles went white, and I whispered to myself, "Don't cry, not here, not now, there will be time for that later, but right now you need to think." And so I drove back to work with a storm inside me, no one around me knowing that my whole world had just shifted. That in the space of a lunch break I had discovered the man I shared my life with was not sick at all. He was scheming, and that every tender moment I thought we still had was just a cover for his cruel intentions. And as I sat there at my desk pretending to work, I knew one thing with certainty. I would not collapse under his betrayal. I would not allow him to strip me of the life I built. I would fight, but I would do it quietly, carefully, with the patience of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. That afternoon at work felt like the longest of my life. I sat at my desk with papers in front of me, but none of the words made sense. My hands moved, pretending to write, pretending to keep busy, while my mind replayed his voice over and over, that mocking laughter. Those words about me being old and tired, those words about the deed, as if it was just waiting to be stolen from my hands. And every time I heard it again in my head, the wound cut deeper. But alongside the pain, something else began to grow. Something steady and cold. The beginning of a plan. I realized that rushing into the house and confronting him would have given him the chance to twist everything, to play sick again, to swear I had misunderstood, to make me feel like the foolish one. But by walking away silently, I had given myself the most precious weapon. Time. Time to think. Time to prepare. Time to gather proof that could not be denied. And as I sat there forcing myself to look calm while inside I was shaking, I whispered a promise to myself that I would not let him win. That after all I had endured, I would not end up broken and empty-handed. On the outside, I smiled when coworkers spoke to me. I nodded at their words. I laughed at their small jokes, but inside my mind was racing. I began to think of every document we had, every account we shared, every piece of paper with both our names written on it. And I knew that if he had a plan to strip me of everything, then I needed to move faster than him. I needed to protect what was rightfully mine before he could take another step. And so I began to map it all out quietly, hiding my fury beneath a steady mask, waiting for the moment when I could act. The clock ticked slowly toward evening, each minute dragging, as though the world itself wanted me to sit in this torment. But I did not let despair take me. I let it harden me instead. I told myself that silence was my strength, that the less he knew, the more power I would hold. And by the time I packed up my things to go home, I already knew what my next days would look like. Not days of tears and begging for answers, but days of gathering every shred of evidence, every document, every record that could protect me. Because if he thought I was old and tired, he was about to learn that age does not mean weakness, and silence does not mean surrender. That evening, when I walked back into the house, I carried myself as if nothing had happened. I set down my bag. I asked him softly if he was feeling any better, and he gave me a weak smile, coughing into his hand like the actor he was. And though every part of me wanted to scream at him, to throw his lies back into his face, I kept my voice steady. I spooned out the soup I had made earlier and placed it in front of him, watching as he pretended to struggle lifting the spoon. And in that moment I realized just how far his deception went. He had not only lied to me, he had created an entire performance meant to keep me blind. I sat there across from him, nodding, pretending to be concerned, my heart hammering in my chest. But behind my calm eyes, my thoughts were racing. I was already thinking of the drawer where we kept the house papers, the filing cabinet with the bank statements, the envelopes tucked away in the closet that held insurance documents. I was already planning how I would quietly take them piece by piece and make copies, how I would store them where he could not touch them, how I would turn his game against him without him even realizing it. After dinner, he leaned back, sighing heavily, as though just swallowing food had exhausted him. And I forced myself to smile. I told him I would clean up. And as I washed the dishes, my tears blurred the water in the sink. But I did not let them fall onto my face. I held them back, because I knew if I allowed myself to break in that moment, he would see it, he would sense it, and he would change his plan. And I could not allow him to know that I had heard the truth. Not yet. Not until I was ready. When he finally went to bed, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing that sounded so steady for a man who claimed to be ill. And I whispered to myself in the darkness that this would be the last time I ever let him control the story. That from now on I would control what he saw, what he knew, and what he believed. And while he thought I was still the loyal wife tending to his every need, I would be quietly building my defense, preparing the blow that would end his schemes once and for all. And that thought gave me the strength to close my eyes and wait for morning. The next morning I rose before him, moving quietly through the house as I always had, but this time every step carried a new purpose. I brewed the coffee, I set the table, and I laid out his medicine just like before. Yet in my heart, I was no longer the same woman. I was no longer blind. I was watching every detail, memorizing every expression, studying the way he shifted in his chair, and the way his hand lingered too long on his phone. And I knew that behind that mask of weakness, there was calculation. And behind that cough, there was a lie. But I let him believe I was still fooled, because that was the only way I could move in silence. When he went back to bed, I slipped into the room where we kept our files, my hands shaking slightly as I opened the cabinet, pulling out envelopes, deeds, bank statements, and policy papers. I spread them out across the table, my eyes moving over numbers and names, searching for anything that could expose the depths of his plan. And with every page I touched, I felt my resolve grow stronger. Because these were not just papers, they were the pieces of my life. Years of work, years of sacrifice, years of building something that he thought he could strip from me with a laugh and a promise to another woman. But I would not let him. I made copies quietly, slipping them into a folder I hid at the bottom of my work bag. And when he asked me later why I seemed distracted, I smiled and told him I was simply tired from worrying about him. And he believed me. He even squeezed my hand, looking me in the eyes as though I was still the fool he had always counted on. And in that moment, I nearly broke. Because to stare into the face of someone you have loved for decades and realize they are capable of plotting against you is a pain no words can truly capture. But I forced myself to hold steady. I forced myself to meet his gaze with calmness, because I knew that his arrogance would be my advantage. And the more convinced he was of my ignorance, the easier it would be for me to finish what I had started. So day after day I continued in silence, cooking his meals, washing his clothes, tending to the man who pretended to be sick, all while collecting every detail, moving money from accounts, setting aside documents, preparing my trust. And each night, as I lay beside him, I repeated the same thought over and over, that one day soon the lies he spun so easily would collapse on top of him. And the very woman he underestimated would be the one to deliver the final blow. As the days passed, I kept building my quiet defense, slipping documents into folders, moving small amounts of money, securing the things I had once believed were safe simply because they were ours. And with each step I felt myself growing stronger, not weaker. Because for the first time in years, I was not just reacting to him. I was taking control. I was holding the pen that would write the end of this story. And though my heart still ached with the sharp edge of betrayal, my mind was sharper, more focused, more determined than ever. There were moments when I almost faltered, moments when he looked at me with those familiar eyes and spoke in that soft voice, moments when he reached for my hand pretending to need comfort. And in those moments, I wanted to believe the man I had once loved was still there somewhere. But then I would remember the cruel laughter in the living room, the words that rolled so easily off his tongue about my age, about my tired body, about the deed he planned to snatch from me, and any trace of weakness hardened into resolve. Because love that mocks you is not love at all. And loyalty that feeds off your pain is nothing but poison. I was not alone in this journey either. I turned to someone I trusted outside of the house, someone who had seen enough of life to know what betrayal looked like. And I shared with them the pieces of evidence I had gathered, and when they looked me in the eye and told me I was right to protect myself, a weight lifted from my shoulders. Because for so long I had carried this secret in silence, pretending everything was fine while my world cracked beneath me, and hearing another voice confirm the truth gave me the strength to continue without hesitation. Each day I played my role. Each night I whispered to myself that I was getting closer. Closer to the moment when the lies would unravel. Closer to the day when he would finally see the woman he thought was weak rise with the power of her own silence. And though it hurt to smile across the dinner table, to listen to his fake coughs and his pitiful sighs, I kept my calm. Because I knew that soon enough it would be me sitting across from him in a different room. A room where truth would no longer be hidden behind masks, and where I would finally take back everything he tried to steal from me. The morning I finally decided to act came quietly. There was no thunder in the sky, no great sign to tell me this was the day, but inside me I felt it, a calm steadiness that told me I had gathered enough, that I had prepared my ground well, and that it was time to move from silence to action. I packed my bag as usual, kissed him on the forehead as he lay there pretending to be weak, and walked out the door with a smile on my face. But tucked in that bag was the folder of documents I had been collecting piece by piece, every proof of ownership, every account detail, every shred of evidence that would shield me from his greed, and I carried them not with fear, but with a sense of finality. At the office, I called the lawyer whose name had been given to me by my trusted friend. And when I sat across from that desk, my hands trembling slightly as I laid out the folder, I felt the weight of 32 years pressing down on me. But I also felt the lift of freedom beginning to rise. The lawyer looked through everything carefully, nodding, asking questions, and with each answer, I gave my voice grew firmer. No longer the voice of a woman doubting herself, but of a woman who knew she had been betrayed and who would not allow that betrayal to strip her of her dignity or her security. Together, we drafted the steps, transferring the deed into a trust where his hands could never reach, closing the joint accounts he thought he controlled, securing what I worked for so that it could no longer be used as a bargaining chip in his cruel game. And as I signed each paper, as I pressed my pen down onto each line, I felt as though I was cutting through the chains that had bound me for too long, reclaiming not just my property, but my voice, my power, and my right to stand tall without his shadow looming over me. When I left that office, the air felt different, cleaner, brighter, as though even the world itself recognized that a shift had taken place. I walked with steady steps, clutching the copies of the new documents. And though I still had to return to the house where he waited, coughing into his hand and pretending to be frail, I knew I was no longer walking back as the same woman. I was no longer the wife holding her breath in fear of what he might do. I was now the wife who had already sealed his fate with the quiet stroke of a pen. And all that remained was to watch the moment when he would finally realize that the game he played was one he had already lost. That evening, when I returned home, I carried myself with the same calm smile, setting down my bag and moving around the kitchen as though nothing at all had changed. He sat there in his chair with a blanket pulled over his legs, coughing into his fist in that pitiful way he had perfected, asking me how my day had been, and I answered gently, saying it was busy but fine, all the while knowing that in my bag sat the papers that had already placed everything beyond his reach. And as I stirred the pot on the stove, I thought to myself how strange it felt to live in two worlds at once. The one he believed in, where I was still blind and loyal, and the one I now held where I had quietly stripped away his power piece by piece. I watched him that night more closely than ever. The way he lowered his eyes when I asked simple questions. The way his lips curled into a faint smile when he thought I was not looking. And instead of feeling pain, I felt a deep sense of control, because I knew something he did not. I knew that the walls he thought were closing in around me had already shifted to close around him. And while he believed he was steps ahead of me, the truth was that I was already miles ahead, waiting for the moment when I would show him what silence had been hiding all along. After dinner, I cleared the plates, my hands steady, my movements deliberate, and I thought about the meeting that had been set with the lawyer. The day circled on the calendar in my mind when he would sit across from me, not as the master of his game, but as the man caught in it. And I could almost see the look that would cross his face when he realized that every word he had laughed about, every cruel line he had spoken into that phone, had only become the fuel for my resolve. And though he believed me weak and tired, I was stronger than I had ever been. Later, as he drifted off to sleep with a fake cough lingering on his lips, I lay beside him, staring into the darkness, no longer with tears in my eyes, but with a strange kind of peace, because I knew that the hardest part was behind me. I had endured the shock, I had borne the silence, I had gathered the strength, and now I was simply waiting for the morning when the mask he wore would be torn away, not by my anger or my cries, but by the steady hand of truth laid bare in front of him. And it was that thought that finally allowed me to close my eyes and rest, even in the same bed as the man who had betrayed me. The day of truth arrived quietly. I asked him to come with me to what I told him was a routine meeting, nothing more than paperwork that needed his signature, and he followed without suspicion, still believing I was the same trusting wife he had always manipulated. He walked into the lawyer's office with his shoulders slouched, pretending to be frail, and he even coughed into his hand as he sat down across from me. But I did not look at him with pity anymore. I looked at him with steady eyes, because I knew what was about to unfold would change everything. The lawyer began to lay out the documents one by one, explaining the changes, explaining the transfers, explaining how the property was now protected in a trust, how the accounts had been secured, how the signatures were already in place. And with every word spoken, I watched his expression shift, his fake weakness falling away, as the reality of what I had done began to sink in. His lips parted, his eyes darted back and forth, and finally his voice stumbled out, asking what this meant, asking why I had done it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt no fear as I answered. I told him calmly that I had heard every word on that phone call, that I knew about the woman's laughter, that I knew about his plan to strip me of everything I had built. And I told him that he had mistaken my silence for ignorance. But what he never understood was that silence can be stronger than shouting. Because while he mocked me and thought he was winning, I was quietly preparing to end the game he thought he controlled. And now the proof was in front of him. Undeniable, signed, sealed, and final. He tried to speak, his words tumbling out in half-formed excuses. He said I had misunderstood. He said he was only joking. He said he never meant to hurt me. But his voice shook, his hands trembled, and his eyes betrayed the fear he could no longer hide, while I sat there steady, listening to the lies dissolve into nothing because they no longer had the power to wound me. The papers on the table had already cut the ties that bound me to his betrayal. And, for the first time in years, I felt free, not because I had shouted him down, but because I had outlasted him in silence and risen with strength he never saw coming. When we left that office, he walked beside me in silence, the man who once laughed so easily now reduced to stammering in shame, and I did not gloat, I did not raise my voice. I simply carried myself with the dignity he thought I had lost, because in that moment I knew I had reclaimed more than just papers or property. I had reclaimed my peace, and as I looked back on the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, I realized that betrayal had not broken me. It had revealed a strength I never knew I had. And that was worth more than anything he ever tried to take. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of my story. Your time and your presence mean more than I can ever truly express. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. And if my words have touched you in any way, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe so that we can continue to share more truths together.